and welcome to Games as Lit 101. Today's topic is something that I think is vitally important to a good understanding of video games as a narrative medium. This is about the difference between gameplay and interactivity. Unfortunately, current game studies tend to use these two words more or less interchangeably, and I've seen it cause a lot of confusion in recent discussion of game design, especially where things like art games, visual novels, and some recent adventure games even are concerned. Though we tend to use the two words in the same ways right now, I think that there are two different concepts we need to be getting at here. The difference is this. Interactivity is simply the ability to interact with a game, whereas gameplay is specifically the game systems and challenges of the game. Now, these may seem very similar, but stick with me. Gameplay is a type of interactivity, but interactivity itself is a much broader concept. You're interacting with a game with literally anything you do, whether you're playing the game, or making a moral choice, or even just navigating the menus. In short, interactivity is just a much bigger idea than gameplay. Gameplay itself tends to vary in definition. For instance, Sid Meier once defined it simply as a series of interesting choices. But most definitions of the term tend to look to more traditional concepts of game design for the sake of a more detailed idea of exactly what gameplay is. According to classic game studies, which of course are far older than the medium of video games, gameplay is comprised of the mechanics and the dynamics of a game, designed in such a way as to provide challenges for the player to overcome, as well as rules by which the player will overcome them. So for instance, racing RC cars is a game, because racing has rules and goals, whereas just playing with an RC car in your backyard would not be a game, even though you're clearly interacting with it, because those elements of structure and challenge are non-existent. So the gist of this distinction is that gameplay is specifically about mechanics and challenge, whereas interactivity does include that, but is certainly not limited to it. So then, why is this important to narrative? In short, it's because there are a lot of meaningful ways to interact with a video game, and our traditional concept of a game is only one of them. From art games to many modern adventure games, there are a lot of works out there clearly challenging the idea that video games need to be all based around gameplay systems. Even many normal games that we get today tend to offer non-game forms of interaction as their core engagement. When you make a choice in Dragon Age, for example, it's usually one that will affect the story, but not the actual process of play. The gameplay is unaffected, and yet this ability to alter the story is by far the most beloved and emphasized element of the series. But despite Dragon Age basing its appeal mostly on its varied story paths, most never question its gameness because it still has plenty of traditional mechanical game elements. Compare that to a game like Heavy Rain, which sparked controversy upon its release because of its general lack of gameplay elements. Though technically a game, the gameplay was very simple, and the player's performance only affected the story, and could not result in either victory or defeat. Another recent example, in a different way, is Dear Esther. This game consists only of exploring an island while a narrator recounts a story, and even more than Heavy Rain, it features no challenge, victory, or defeat. Many people have claimed that these games aren't actually games at all, which is... that's understandable from a technical, ludological standpoint. They certainly lack many of the elements that we normally associate with traditional game design. But the problem comes along when it's not a game becomes it's not interactive. When it comes down to it, most not a game claims exist only to allow arrogant, elitist gamers to erect imaginary walls between themselves and people they think are somehow beneath them. That said, there is some value in actually considering these distinctions, so let's approach this topic with a rational and analytical intent. Many people claimed that Heavy Rain may as well have been a movie, with its cinematic style and minimalistic gameplay, but this really isn't the case. Though it lacks in gameplay complexity and challenge, it puts the story heavily in the hands of the player. Failure in some sequences results in the permanent death of a character, and there are 16 different ending sequences, a few for each of the 4 principal characters depending on their status at the end, that can be combined into a huge number of different ending circumstances. With that much control over the story, there's simply no way that Heavy Rain could exist in any other art form, no matter how visually similar it may be to film. The same goes for Dear Esther. The player's ability to explore the island is key to the experience, as is the mild randomization of the narration that gives the player different insights into the story each time they play through the game. It's a story of heavy meaning and symbolic depth, and it's notably more powerful as an interactive work than it would have been as a linear one. The same can be said for many other art games as well, such as Passage, The Stanley Parable, and Loneliness. This is why the distinction between gameplay and interactivity is so important for a good understanding of interactive art. All interaction with an artwork must be structured, of course, but a game is not the only way to do that. Some concepts are simply better explored by allowing the player to explore an environment on their own time, without victory or defeat being a concern. Some stories are simply more powerful for putting important choices in the player's hands. Tying the worth of an interactive work to the presence of complex rule sets or competitive goals isn't going to move this medium forward. We need to consider all the ways that video games engage people, be that through games or simpler forms of interaction. Now, of course, I'm not saying that video games can't be games if they want to be meaningful. That would be completely ridiculous. Combining game and narrative comes with its challenges, and of course we'll be talking about a lot of those on this show. But there's no reason why it can't be done effectively, and in fact it has been done effectively many times. Maybe I'm just a sensitive guy. But I can name a good few games that have made me cry. And even more games that have made me deeply think about some aspect of my life or worldview. Video games with awesome gameplay will always be an important and awesome part of this medium. But we're not going to get anywhere by trying to limit this fantastic new art form to its original concept. What do you think about this? Do you think video games should just stick to what they're already doing? Or would you like to see what the medium's capable of when it's unrestricted by expectations of game design? If you have anything to say, write it in the comments. I'd love to get some discussion going on this topic. So until next week, class dismissed.